black pea coats and undershirts became symbols of unyielding fortitude in the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet Marine Corps fought its way from the Arctic to Crimea, from defense to victorious landings. 122 heroes of the Soviet Union, 5 Guards brigades, 110 Marine landings, numbers that represent destinies and feats. They held Odessa and Sevastopol, broke through the Blockade of Leningrad, and stormed the Kuril Islands. Why did the Germans call them Black Death? How did the Marines become the elite of the Soviet armed forces? The history of the most legendary branch of the military begins right now. If you are interested in the history of the Great Patriotic War, subscribe to the channel and like this video. In the comments, I suggest discussing a controversial question. Could Sevastopol have been held in 1942 if it weren't for the Kerch-Feodosia landing? Or was the fate of the city already sealed? I look forward to hearing your opinions. On June 22, 1941, the war caught the Soviet Navy off guard. Of all 4 fleets and several flotillas, there was only one Marine brigade, the first separate Marine brigade of the Baltic Fleet, formed a year earlier on the basis of the Special Rifle Brigade. This unit, stationed in the Leningrad area, became the first sign of the revival of the glorious traditions of the Russian Marines, dating back to the time of Peter the Great and the storming of Izmail under the command of Alexander Vasilyevich Suvorov. The Fleet Command understood the importance of specially trained units for amphibious operations, but the mobilization plan for 1941 did not provide for the deployment of Marines. There was no established organizational structure, no unified training program, and no sufficient number of amphibious vehicles. The officer corps was formed from graduates of general military schools who had undergone retraining in the Navy. Enlisted personnel and junior commanders were recruited in accordance with the regulations on service in the Navy. The first days of the war showed that one brigade was catastrophically insufficient. The enemy was rapidly advancing deep into Soviet territory in all directions. The coastal cities of Odessa, Sevastopol, Tallinn, and Murmansk were under threat of capture. The Fleet Command received orders to urgently form Marine units from the personnel of ships, coastal units, and naval academies. This marked the beginning of the legend of the Black Jackets, who would become one of the symbols of the unyielding fortitude of the Soviet soldier. Sailors and petty officers were taken off combat ships and sent to the newly formed regiments and brigades. Ship commanders reluctantly parted with their best specialists, understanding the need to strengthen the land front. Red Navy sailors, accustomed to ship service, mastered rifles, machine guns, anti-tank guns, and grenades. Many of them had never held small arms before, but their high level of naval discipline, excellent physical training, and traditional naval resourcefulness quickly turned the sailors into formidable fighters. By the end of June, several separate Marine battalions had been formed in the Baltic Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet created 2 Marine regiments to defend Odessa. The Northern Fleet formed its own units to defend Murmansk and Polyarny. The Azov Military Flotilla and the Danube Flotilla also began to create naval units. The process proceeded quickly, without bureaucratic delays. The war demanded immediate action. A distinctive feature of the Marines was their versatility. Marines were intended for amphibious operations, the defense of naval bases and important coastal strongholds, but they could also act as regular infantry on any section of the front. This flexibility of application would become one of the key factors in the effectiveness of the Black Pea Coats during the war years. Sailors fought wherever special fortitude and determination were required. The uniform became a symbol of the Marine Corps. Red Navy sailors kept their black pea coats, undershirts, and peakless caps, even in land battles. This tradition had a deep psychological meaning. The naval uniform distinguished the fighters from the regular infantry, emphasizing their affiliation with the fleet and their special status. The enemy quickly learned to recognize the black pea coats and treated them with caution. The reputation of the Marines as desperate and ruthless fighters spread rapidly. The Marines gained their first combat experience in July 1941. Baltic Marines participated in the defense of Tallinn, covering the retreat of the main forces of the fleet. Separate battalions and companies were landed on the islands of the Moonsund archipelago, delaying the enemy's advance towards Leningrad. On the Black Sea, Marine regiments were preparing for the defense of Odessa, which was about to begin. In the Arctic, Marines took up defensive positions on the approaches to Murmansk. Organizationally, the Marine units were modeled on the Red Army's rifle formations, but with some differences. A Marine brigade numbered about 4,000 men and consisted of 3 or 4 rifle battalions, an artillery division, a communications company, and other support units. The weapons were standard for infantry: rifles, carbines, machine guns, mortars, anti-tank guns, and small-caliber artillery. Special attention was paid to training for hand-to-hand combat and small group operations. The training was intensive but brief. The situation on the front lines did not allow for lengthy training of reinforcements. The Marines received basic shooting skills, tactics for offensive and defensive operations, and studied the basics of engineering. Naval training and discipline compensated for the lack of special training. Sailors quickly became experienced fighters right in the heat of battle, learning to survive and win in the most difficult conditions. By the end of the summer of 1941, the Marines already numbered several tens of thousands. The formation of new units continued in all fleets. Black pea coats and undershirts became recognizable on the fronts, from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. The Marines proved that the Navy could fight not only on water, but also on land, and with no less effectiveness. The first chapter in the history of the military Marines was written with blood and courage. Sailors, accustomed to the rocking of the deck, now dug in trenches, stormed heights, and defended cities. They preserved naval traditions, bringing them into land warfare. The motto, "Where we are, there is victory," had not yet been uttered, but it was already being put into practice. But the hardest trials were yet to come. Odessa, Sevastopol, Leningrad, Stalingrad, cities where black pea jackets would write the most vivid pages of their history. Cities that would become symbols of the invincibility of the Soviet spirit. An era of great battles was beginning, in which the Marines would play a decisive role. On August 5, 1941, one of the most dramatic pages in the history of the Soviet Marines began. The defense of Odessa. The Romanian army, supported by German units, approached the city, intending to capture it on the march. 14 infantry divisions, 7 cavalry brigades, and a powerful artillery group of the enemy, with a tenfold superiority, descended on Odessa. The Black Sea Fleet Command decided to defend the city to the last, turning it into an impregnable fortress on the seashore. The Marines formed the basis of the defense. By the beginning of the siege, the 1st and 2nd Marine Regiments, formed from sailors and Red Navy personnel taken from the ships of the squadron, were in Odessa. The 1st Regiment was commanded by Colonel Yakov Ivanovich Osipov, and the 2nd by Colonel Ivan Fedorovich Dashchenko. These units became the backbone of the Primorskaya Army, which took the first blow from the enemy troops. Sailors occupied the most dangerous sections of the defense, where special fortitude was required. A defensive line was hastily created around the city. 3 lines of trenches, anti-tank ditches, pillboxes and bunkers, minefields and wire barriers turned the outskirts of Odessa into a real fortified zone. The Marines dug trenches day and night, ignoring the artillery fire. Naval discipline and organization allowed them to carry out their tasks with maximum efficiency. Every soldier understood that there was nowhere to retreat, with the sea and the city behind them. On August 9th, Romanian troops launched their first assault. The Marines met the enemy with heavy fire. The Romanians attacked in waves, but each time they were pushed back, suffering huge losses. The sailors fought with unparalleled courage, not giving up a single meter of ground. When they ran out of ammunition, the soldiers went into bayonet attacks, using rifle butts, knives, and even their fists. The enemy was shocked by such fierce resistance. A distinctive feature of the Odessa defense was the counterattacks by the Marines. The command did not limit itself to passive defense. The Marines regularly went on the offensive, driving the enemy out of their positions. Night raids by small groups of sailors sowed panic in the Romanian ranks. Black pea coats appeared suddenly, struck, and disappeared just as quickly into the darkness. The enemy began to call the Soviet Marines Black Death. The fleet supplied the besieged city by sea. Destroyers, cruisers, and transports broke through to the port of Odessa, delivering ammunition, food, and reinforcements. Naval artillery supported the ground forces, raining shells on enemy positions. Naval aviation bombed concentrations of enemy troops. Odessa held out thanks to the close cooperation between the land forces and the fleet, exactly as intended when the Marines were created. In September, new forces arrived in Odessa. The 3rd Marine Brigade, commanded by Colonel Ilya Konstantinovich Bobrikov, landed in the port, strengthening the defenses. The brigade numbered almost 4,000 fighters who had undergone accelerated training in Sevastopol. The Marines immediately took up one of the most dangerous defensive positions in the Dalnik area, where the Romanians made daily attempts to break through the Soviet lines. On September 16th, the enemy launched a decisive assault. 10 divisions simultaneously attacked Odessa from different directions. The Romanians were confident that the city's defenders were exhausted and would not withstand the onslaught. But the Marines once again showed their mettle. In one section, 2 companies of Marines held back the attacks of an entire enemy division for 8 hours. The fighters fought to the last bullet, and when the bullets ran out, they went in with bayonets. The battle at Height 102 became legendary. A platoon of Marines under the command of Senior Sergeant Ivan Mikhailovich Parshin held the defense at this height. The Romanians attacked 20 times a day, but were unable to dislodge the Marines. When only 3 fighters remained alive, they blew themselves up along with the enemies who had broken through to their position. The height remained in the hands of the Soviet troops. The Marines did not only defend themselves. On September 22nd, a major offensive operation was carried out. Marine units landed behind Romanian troops near the village of Grigorievka. The landing force captured a bridgehead and held it for several days, distracting significant enemy forces. This operation thwarted another Romanian offensive on Odessa. During the 73 days of defense, the Marines carried out 13 major counterattacks and numerous small sorties. The enemy lost about 160,000 men killed and wounded near Odessa, more than during the capture of Poland. The city became a symbol of indomitability. The Marines proved that they could not only defend themselves, but also attack and defeat an enemy that outnumbered them. However, the strategic situation forced the Soviet command to make a difficult decision. Troops from the Odessa bridgehead had to be transferred to defend Crimea. The evacuation began on October 16th. In 5 nights, the fleet transported the entire Primorsk army, 86,000 soldiers, including all Marine Corps units, out of Odessa. The operation was a resounding success. The enemy never realized that the city had been abandoned. The Marines were the last to leave, covering the evacuation of the rest of the troops. The sailors held their defenses until the last moment, then withdrew in an orderly fashion to the port and boarded the ships. On the morning of October 17th, the Romanians cautiously entered the deserted Odessa, expecting ambushes and traps. They were shocked. The city had been abandoned, but not surrendered. The defense of Odessa went down in history as an example of brilliant organization of defense and evacuation by sea. The Odessa regiments and Marine brigades went to Sevastopol, where they were to write a new heroic chapter in their history. The experience gained in the battles near Odessa would prove invaluable for future battles. The Marines proved that they deserved the title of elite troops, but the main trials were still ahead. Sevastopol was waiting for its defenders. On October 30th, 1941, the defense of Sevastopol, the main naval base of the Black Sea Fleet, began. The city, founded by Catherine II as an impregnable fortress, was once again preparing for a siege. German and Romanian troops were rapidly advancing across Crimea, cutting off the peninsula from the mainland. Sevastopol was becoming the last stronghold of Soviet troops in Crimea, and holding it was of strategic importance for the entire southern flank of the front. The backbone of the defense was made up of Marines evacuated from Odessa. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Marine regiments, hardened in the battles for Odessa, took up key positions on the approaches to the city. They were joined by new units, the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 8th Marine regiments, formed from Red Navy sailors and cadets from naval academies. In total, about 20,000 Marines participated in the defense of Sevastopol. The defense of the city was commanded by Vice Admiral Philip Sergeyevich Oktyabrski, commander of the Black Sea Fleet. The land forces were led by Major General Ivan Efimovich Petrov. The Marines were directly subordinate to the command of the Primorsk Army, but worked closely with the fleet's coastal defense forces. The artillery of the naval base including powerful 305mm turret guns, provided fire support for the Marines. The first assault on Sevastopol began on November 11th. The German 11th Army, commanded by Colonel General Erich von Manstein, struck from the north. 5 infantry and 2 mountain divisions, supported by aircraft, attacked the outer defensive line. The Marines took the brunt of the attack on the Mackenzie Mountains, the heights dominating the northern approaches to the city. The fighting for the Mackenzie Hills lasted 10 days. The Marines fought for every hill, every trench. The Germans threw fresh divisions into the attack, but the Black Peacoats stood their ground. When the enemy broke through to their positions, the Marines counterattacked, driving the enemy back with bayonets and rifle butts. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the Marines did not retreat. Particularly fierce fighting took place for Hill 150.8. The 5th Company of the 7th Marine Brigade, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Sergeyevich Odintsov, defended this hill for 3 days. The Germans attacked 24 times, but were unable to break the resistance. When only 17 men remained in the company, they still held their position. The hill was unofficially named Sailors' Hill. The first assault faltered on November 21st. The Germans were forced to stop and regroup. In 3 weeks of fighting, they had advanced only a few kilometers and lost more troops than during the capture of the whole of France. The Marines showed that Sevastopol would resist to the last. The Wehrmacht command realized that a quick capture of the city would not be possible. On December 17th, the second assault began. Manstein pulled additional forces to Sevastopol, including heavy artillery and siege guns. The German command planned to break through to the North Bay and capture the city from the north. The main attack was launched in the Belbek River area, where the defense was held by Marines of the 1st Sevastopol Regiment under the command of Colonel Pyotr Fedorovich Gorpishchenko. The artillery preparation lasted several hours. The Germans rained thousands of shells and mines on the Marines' positions. But when the enemy infantry went on the attack, they were met with fierce fire. The sailors crawled out of their destroyed shelters and opened fire with their surviving weapons. The Germans suffered huge losses, but continued to advance, realizing that it was now or never. The critical moment came on December 31st. The Germans broke through the defenses and reached the North Bay in the Inkerman area. The city was in danger of being captured. But then, the reserves entered the battle. The 2nd Marine Brigade and combined detachments of sailors from the ships. The counterattack was carried out on New Year's Eve. The Marines drove the enemy out of their positions in bayonet combat and restored the front line. The second assault continued until the end of January 1942. The Germans were unable to break through into the city. The Marines once again proved their resilience. However, the defenders' losses were enormous. Many Marine regiments and brigades lost half of their personnel. New sailors taken from ships replaced those who had been killed, and the wounded returned to duty after being treated in hospitals. In the spring of 1942, there was a relative lull. The enemy was preparing for a decisive third assault, gathering forces and heavy artillery. Famous siege guns arrived in Sevastopol, including the giant 800mm caliber Dora. The Soviet command tried to supply the city by sea and air, But the blockade was becoming tighter and tighter. On June 7th, the third and final assault on Sevastopol began. The Germans and Romanians threw 214,000 soldiers, 450 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft against the city. The enemy's artillery included 2,000 guns and mortars of all calibers. It was one of the most powerful forces ever assembled to storm a single city. The Marines held out for 3 weeks. The fighting was for every house, every street, every trench. The sailors fought while completely surrounded, with no hope of help. Ammunition was running out, food was running out, but the Black Jackets did not give up. They knew that every day of Sevastopol's defense eased the situation on other fronts and gave time to prepare for a major offensive. On July 4th, the remnants of the garrison received orders to break through. An organized evacuation was impossible. The enemy completely controlled the sea and the air. The Marines fought their way to Cape Chersonesos, from where submarines and boats attempted to evacuate the soldiers. But most of the defenders were killed or taken prisoner. On July 8th, the resistance ceased. Sevastopol fell after 250 days of defense. The Marines paid a terrible price for defending the main naval base. Thousands of sailors were left lying on the approaches to Sevastopol and on its streets. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The defense of the city tied down a large German force that could have been used elsewhere. The legend of the indestructible Black Peacoats spread across all fronts. But could the Marines recover from such losses and return to duty? While the Marines were fighting for Odessa and Sevastopol in the south, a war was unfolding in the far north. A cold, cruel war, unnoticed by most of the country. The defense of the Arctic became one of the longest operations of the Great Patriotic War, lasting 1,218 days without interruption. The Marines of the Northern Fleet met the war on the icy cliffs of the Rybachi and Sredny peninsulas, defending the approaches to Murmansk, the only ice-free port in the north. On June 29, 1941, the German Mountain Rifle Corps, Norway, went on the offensive. The goal was ambitious: to capture Murmansk in a few days, cut off the Murmansk Railway, and deprive the Soviet Union of communication with its allies via the Northern Sea route. The Germans threw specially trained mountain rifle divisions, hunters, and units of the Finnish army into battle. They were confident of a quick victory. But the Marines of the Northern Defense District stood in their way. The 12th Marine Brigade, commanded by Colonel Viktor Vladimirovich Rasukin, took up defensive positions on the Sredny Peninsula. The 14th Brigade held Rybachi. These Arctic cliffs, covered with moss and buffeted by icy winds, became an insurmountable obstacle for the Wehrmacht. The Marines dug in on the rocky tundra, creating a system of strongholds. The conditions of war in the Arctic were extremely harsh. The polar night lasted for months. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, and hurricane-force winds knocked people off their feet. It was almost impossible to dig in among the rocks. They had to blast the stone and lay boulders for protection. Supplies were delivered only by sea on boats and by air. But the Marines, accustomed to the harsh conditions of naval service, endured what seemed unbearable. The German mountain hunters were considered the elite of the Wehrmacht. They had undergone special training for combat in the mountains and Arctic conditions and had the best equipment and gear. But when they encountered the Soviet Marines, the hunters realized that they were facing an enemy that was just as tenacious and well-trained. The Black Jackets knew every rock and every fold of the terrain, and used this knowledge to maximum effect. On July 7th, the Germans began their assault on the Sredny Peninsula. 3 divisions attacked the positions of the 12th Marine Brigade. The artillery preparation was short. Artillery is not very effective in rocky terrain. The Jaegers went on the attack, relying on their training and numerical superiority. But the Marines met them with deadly fire from camouflaged positions. Fighting in the tundra had its own specific characteristics. There was no continuous front line here, only strong points and outposts. Small groups of sailors controlled key heights and passes. The Germans tried to bypass the strong points, but each time they encountered new positions. The Marines skillfully used the terrain, setting up ambushes and sudden raids on enemy communications. Marine scouts earned particular fame. They carried out raids deep into enemy territory, captured tongues, mined roads, and destroyed warehouses. The reconnaissance company of the 12th Brigade, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Viktor Nikolaevich Leonov, became a legend of the Northern Fleet. During the war, Leonov's scouts carried out 52 operations behind enemy lines without suffering a single defeat. In September, the Germans made a decisive attempt to break through. The Norway Mountain Corps received reinforcements and a new task: to capture Murmansk at any cost before the onset of winter. 8 divisions descended on Soviet positions, but the Marines did not flinch. The fighting went on day and night, in blizzards and frost. Each hill changed hands several times, but the front line did not budge. Marines in the Arctic fought not only on land, they landed from ships and boats behind enemy lines, carrying out daring amphibious operations. On April 28, 1942, a Marine company landed in the area of Cape Piksuev, captured a German base, and destroyed the garrison. Such operations kept the Germans in constant tension. In the winter of 1941-1942, the front line stabilized. The Germans were unable to break through to Murmansk. The Norway Mountain Corps went on the defensive, digging in among the rocks. A war of position began, which would last 3 years. The Marines controlled the Rybachi and Sredny peninsulas, turning them into unsinkable aircraft carriers. From these springboards, Soviet aviation kept the enemy's communications under attack. Life on the peninsulas resembled shipboard service. All supplies came by sea. During storms, boats could not approach the shore for weeks. The soldiers lived in dugouts and caves carved into the rocks. Fresh water had to be brought in or collected from snow. But discipline was ironclad, and morale remained high. The sailors knew they held a key position that ensured the safety of Murmansk and the northern convoys. The Marines in the Arctic developed unique tactics for conducting combat operations in Arctic conditions. White smocks over black pea coats, skis, special equipment for fighting on rocks. All of this was tested in battle. The Germans treated the Polar Devils, as they called the Soviet Marines in the north, with respect and fear. During 3 years of fighting in the Arctic, the Northern Fleet's Marines did not give up a single meter of Soviet territory to the enemy. The Rybachi and Sredny peninsulas remained in our hands. Murmansk continued to operate, receiving Allied convoys. The Murmansk Railway, the road of life, functioned throughout the war. This result was achieved at the cost of incredible strain and thousands of Marines' lives. In 1944, the Arctic Marines would go on the offensive, but that would be later. For now, in 1941-1942, the Marines in the north held their ground, proving that there were no conditions in which the Black Peacoats could not fight and win. But what was happening on other fronts at that time? Where else did the Marines fight during the most critical months of the war? On September 8, 1941, German troops closed the blockade ring around Leningrad. The second largest city in the Soviet Union was cut off from the mainland. The blockade began, which would last 872 days. The Baltic Fleet's Marines became one of the main forces defending the city on the Neva. At the beginning of the blockade, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th separate Marine brigades were stationed in Leningrad. A total of about 30,000 Marines took up defensive positions in the most dangerous areas: the Pulkovo Heights, Kolpino, and near Schlisselburg. These brigades were formed from Red Navy sailors taken from Baltic Fleet ships, Naval Academy cadets, and Komsomol volunteers. On September 9th, the German Army Group North began its assault on Leningrad. The main attack was directed at the Pulkovo Heights, a key position on the southern approaches. If the Germans had captured these heights, the entire southern part of the city would have come under direct artillery fire. The defense was held by the 2nd Marine Brigade under the command of Colonel Alexander Alexandrovich Ionov. The fighting on the Pulkovo Heights lasted 2 weeks. The Germans attacked daily, throwing fresh troops into the battle. The Marines repelled attack after attack, suffering heavy losses. When they ran out of ammunition, the sailors went into bayonet attacks. The enemy was shocked by the fury of the resistance of the Black Peacoats. The heights remained in the hands of the defenders of Leningrad. The Marines played a special role in the defense of Nevskaya Dubrovka, a small bridgehead on the left bank of the Neva. This patch of land, only 2 kilometers wide and 800 meters deep, was held for 8 months. The bridgehead was constantly shelled, but the Marines held on to the death. From here, a breakthrough of the blockade was planned. In the winter of 1941-1942, the Marines participated in all attempts to break through the siege. January 1942. The Lyuban Offensive. Marine brigades stormed German fortifications in the forests and swamps of the Volkhov Front. The operation did not achieve its goal, but it tied up significant enemy forces. In the summer of 1942, the Marines participated in the Sinyavino operation. The goal was to break through the blockade in the narrow corridor between Lake Ladoga and the front. The 4th Marine Brigade, part of the Neva operational group, stormed German fortifications. The fighting in the swampy forests was extremely bloody. The blockade was not broken, but the Germans were unable to expand it. In the city, the Marines served alongside the residents. They cleared debris after bombings, extinguished fires, and helped evacuate the wounded. But most importantly, they held the defense, preventing the enemy from breaking into the city. Every Marine knew that behind him were millions of Leningraders, and there was nowhere to retreat. On January 18, 1943, Operation Iskra began, the breakthrough of the Leningrad blockade. The strike force of the Leningrad front included 3 Marine brigades. On January 7th at 5 o'clock in the morning, artillery preparation began. 2 hours later, the Marines launched their attack across the ice of the Neva River. Crossing under enemy fire was deadly dangerous. The ice cracked from shell explosions and soldiers fell into the icy water. But the Marines did not stop. They reached the left bank and broke into the German trenches. A week of fierce fighting began in the enemy's fortified zone. On January 18th, troops from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts joined forces in the area of Workers' Settlement No. 5. The blockade was broken. A corridor 8 to 11 kilometers wide connected Leningrad with the mainland. The Baltic Fleet's Marines made a decisive contribution to this victory. 3 brigades were awarded Guards titles for breaking through the blockade. But the complete liberation of Leningrad would not happen for another year. On January 14, 1944, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive began. The Marines participated in the assault on Ropsha, Krasnoye Selo, and Pushkin. On January 27th, the blockade was completely lifted. 872 days of siege were over. The Marines of the Baltic Fleet had done their duty. The city had held out. But what other feats did the Black Pea Jackets accomplish on other fronts during those decisive years of the war? On December 26, 1941, at 3 o'clock in the morning, one of the largest amphibious operations of the Great Patriotic War began. The Kerch-Feodosia operation was intended to liberate eastern Crimea and unblock Sevastopol. 43,000 soldiers, including 5 Marine brigades, took part in the operation. The landing took place in winter storm conditions. The waves reached 6 points, which made the landing deadly dangerous. The main strike was directed at the Kerch Peninsula. The Black Sea Fleet and the Azov military flotilla were to land troops in 3 areas simultaneously: near Kerch, Feodosia, and in Kamish-Burun Bay. The German command considered a landing impossible in such conditions and did not expect an attack. But the Soviet command took the risk. Sevastopol was suffocating under siege, and it was necessary to urgently draw off enemy forces. The Marines were the strike force of the landing. The 83rd Marine Rifle Brigade, commanded by Colonel Alexander Stepanovich Potapov, landed first near Kerch. The task was extremely difficult: to capture a bridgehead in the dark, under enemy fire, in icy water. Boats and barges were thrown against rocks, and many ships capsized. But the sailors stubbornly made their way to shore. The 44th Army, including 2 Marine brigades, landed in Feodosia. The cruiser Krasny Kavkaz and several destroyers broke through directly into the port, approaching the docks. Marines jumped from the ships onto the piers under enemy fire. The German garrison was taken by surprise. No one expected Soviet ships to enter the harbor in a storm. The landing in Feodosia turned into a fierce street battle. The Marines stormed the city block by block. By the morning of December 29th, Feodosia had been liberated. The Germans retreated in panic, abandoning their equipment and warehouses. The success exceeded all expectations. In 3 days, the troops advanced 60 kilometers into Crimea, threatening to encircle the entire German group on the peninsula. But they couldn't keep up the momentum. The German command sent reinforcements to Crimea, including a tank division. Manstein, who was in charge of the 11th Army, personally led the counterattack. On January 15th, the Germans launched a powerful counterattack. Soviet troops, who had not had time to consolidate their positions and establish a deep defense, were forced to retreat. On January 18, the Germans recaptured Feodosia. The losses were enormous on both sides. The Marines fought rearguard battles, covering the retreat of the main forces. Many units were cut off and continued to fight while surrounded. A group of 200 Marines held their ground for 3 days in the area of the railway station, repelling attacks by an entire enemy regiment. Despite the retreat from Feodosia, the Kerch bridgehead was successfully held. Soviet troops entrenched themselves at the eastern tip of Crimea, creating a bridgehead 50 kilometers deep. The Marines took up defensive positions, preparing for new battles. The Kerch Peninsula became the scene of fierce fighting that would continue until May 1942. The Kerch-Feodosia operation was of enormous strategic importance. The German command was forced to transfer significant forces to Crimea that had been intended for the assault on Sevastopol. The siege of the Black Sea Fleet's main base was weakened for several months. The defenders of Sevastopol were given a respite to strengthen their defenses. The Marines demonstrated their main strength in this operation. Their ability to conduct landings in extreme conditions. A landing in a winter storm was considered impossible, but the Black Pea Coats proved otherwise. Naval training, the ability to operate in the elements, and selfless bravery made it possible to accomplish what seemed like an impossible task. For their distinction in the Kerch-Feodosia operation, 8 Marines were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Dozens of fighters were awarded orders. The 83rd Marine Rifle Brigade received the honorary name Kerch. The feat of the Marines became an example for all Marines and was included in military textbooks. But new challenges lay ahead. The Kerch bridgehead had to be held under continuous enemy attacks. And on other sections of the vast front, the Marines were writing new pages in their combat history. Where else did the Black Pea Jackets fight during those critical months? In the fall of 1941, when German tank armies were rushing towards Moscow, the Marines of the Baltic Fleet found themselves on the most dangerous front. Operation Typhoon, the Wehrmacht's general offensive on the Soviet capital, began on September 30th. Army Group Center, consisting of 74 divisions, advanced on Moscow with 3 strike groups. The situation was critical. In October, the Western Front Command received several Marine brigades from the High Command's reserves. The 6th, 7th, and 8th Marine Brigades were transported from the Baltic by rail. About 12,000 sailors in Black Pea Coats disembarked at stations in the Moscow suburbs and immediately entered the battle. Many of the soldiers were seeing enemy tanks and land battles of this scale for the first time. Colonel Konstantin Dmitrievich Tseplyayev's 7th Marine Brigade took up defensive positions in the Volokolamsk area. The Volokolamsk Highway, the shortest route to Moscow, passed through here. German tank divisions struck here, seeking to break through to the capital. The Marines dug in on the banks of the Istra River, creating anti-tank defenses. On November 16th, the Germans launched a new offensive, their last attempt to capture Moscow before winter. The Marines took one of the main blows. The enemy threw tank and motorized divisions into battle, supported by aviation. The Marines faced the massive use of armored vehicles for the first time. But their naval training and discipline did not fail them. Using anti-tank rifles, bottles of incendiary mixture, and anti-tank grenades, the sailors burned German tanks. When armored vehicles broke through to their positions, the Marines met them in hand-to-hand combat. Several times, the fighters threw themselves under the tracks of tanks with bundles of grenades, blowing themselves up along with the enemy vehicles. Such self-sacrifice shocked even the seasoned German tankers. On November 23rd, the Germans approached the Istrinsky Reservoir. The 7th Marine Brigade held the last line of defense before Moscow. The Marines were ordered not to retreat under any circumstances. For 3 days, the Marines repelled attacks by superior enemy forces. The losses were enormous, but the line of defense did not waver. By November 25th, the German offensive had run out of steam. On December 6th, Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive near Moscow. The Marines went on the attack. Exhausted by defensive battles, the enemy could not withstand the blow and began to retreat. Marine brigades pursued the enemy, liberating towns and villages near Moscow. The sailors showed that they were capable not only of defending themselves, but also of attacking. The 8th Marine Brigade distinguished itself in the liberation of Istra. The city had been turned by the Germans into a powerful defensive stronghold. On December 11th, the Marines stormed Istra, fighting for every street. By evening, the city was liberated. The enemy retreated, losing most of their equipment and weapons. For the liberation of Istra, the brigade received the honorary name Istrinskaya. The Marines continued their offensive until mid-January 1942. The brigades pursued the enemy and participated in the liberation of Mozhaisk, Zhatsk, and Vyazma. The Germans were pushed back 150 to 300 kilometers from Moscow. The threat to the capital was eliminated. The Black Pea Coats contributed to the Red Army's first major victory in the war. Thousands of Marines were awarded orders and medals for their battles near Moscow. 18 people received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. 3 Marine brigades were transformed into Guards brigades for their mass heroism and high combat training. The reputation of the Black Jackets as an elite force was cemented after the Battle of Moscow. The Marines proved their versatility. Sailors accustomed to ship decks and coastal operations fought successfully in the center of the continent, in the forests and fields of the Moscow region. They mastered anti-tank warfare, learned to storm fortified positions, and operate as part of large military formations. Their naval training helped them quickly adapt to new conditions. After the Battle of Moscow, the naval brigades were given a respite to replenish and reorganize. Many units had suffered heavy losses and needed to restore their combat capability. But by the spring of 1942, the Black Pea Coats would once again enter the fray on other sections of the front. Ahead lay new battles, new feats, and new trials. What other battles awaited the Marines? At 3 o'clock in the morning on February 4th, 1943, one of the most daring amphibious operations of the war began. A detachment of sailors under the command of Major Caesar Lvovich Kunikov landed south of Novorossiysk in the area of the village of Stanichki. The goal was to capture a bridgehead and distract enemy forces from the main direction of the attack. 275 Marines on 18 boats broke through minefields and landed on enemy shores. The Germans did not expect a landing. The Marines captured a beachhead covering an area of about 30 square kilometers with a swift strike. By morning, another 2,100 fighters had been transferred to the shore. The enemy, recovering from the surprise, began counterattacks. But the Marines secured their position, creating a circular defense. The epic of Malaya Zemlya began, a bridgehead that would hold out for 225 days. Malaya Zemlya became a legend. The bridgehead, 7 kilometers wide and 4.5 kilometers deep, was under constant fire. The Germans attacked daily, trying to drive the landing force back into the sea. The Marines held their ground to the death. Supplies came only by sea. Boats broke through at night, delivering ammunition, food, and reinforcements. On February 18, Major Kunikov was killed in another attack. He was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Colonel Nikolai Ivanovich Sipyagin took command of the bridgehead. The defense continued with the same tenacity. Every meter of Malaya Zemlya was soaked with the blood of Marines, but not a single meter was given to the enemy. Life on Malaya Zemlya resembled a ship under siege. The soldiers lived in dugouts carved into the rocks. Water was brought from the mainland or collected from rain. The wounded were evacuated by boat to Gelendzhik. Every night there was a crossing. Some boats carried reinforcements and supplies, while others took away the wounded. German artillery and aircraft shelled the water area, but the crossing continued. The Marines on Malaya Zemlya did not just defend themselves. They regularly carried out raids on enemy positions. Reconnaissance groups captured prisoners, mined roads, and attacked German posts. Active defense kept the enemy on edge, preventing them from transferring forces to other sections of the front. Malaya Zemlya held back an entire German division. Political worker Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, head of the political department of the 18th Army, visited the bridgehead. His memories of Malaya Zemlya, later published in a book, made this bridgehead famous throughout the country. But the feat of the Marines was real and needed no embellishment. 225 days under continuous fire is an example of fortitude and courage. On September 10th, the liberation of Novorossiysk began. The troops of the North Caucasus Front launched an offensive from Malaya Zemlya and other directions. The Marines broke through the German defenses and stormed the city. Street fighting lasted 6 days. On September 16th, Novorossiysk was completely liberated. Malaya Zemlya had fulfilled its mission. 21 Marines were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for the defense of Malaya Zemlya. Thousands of soldiers were awarded orders and medals. The bridgehead went down in history as a symbol of the unyielding fortitude of the Soviet soldier. The name Malaya Zemlya became synonymous with small bridgeheads held at the cost of enormous effort. The Marines on Malaya Zemlya demonstrated all their best qualities: the ability to operate away from the main forces, steadfastness in defense, and the ability to survive in extreme conditions. All this was demonstrated on a narrow strip of Crimean land. Naval training and discipline made it possible to hold the bridgehead against vastly superior forces. After the liberation of Novorossiysk, the Marines continued their advance along the Black Sea coast. Ahead lay the liberation of the Kuban, then Crimea. But the experience of Malaya Zemlya will remain in memory forever. It proved that there are no conditions in which the Marines cannot accomplish a combat mission. Where else did the Black Peacoats fight in 1943? On August 23, 1942, German aircraft launched a massive attack on Stalingrad. The city on the Volga was reduced to ruins, but it did not surrender. All available reserves, including the Marines, were thrown into the battle for Stalingrad. The Volga Military Flotilla and units of the Pacific Fleet sent their brigades to defend the city. About 10,000 Marines took part in the bloodiest battle of the war. General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov's 62nd Army held the defense in the city itself. It included Marine rifle brigades transferred from the Far East. Colonel Andrei Ivanovich Krylov's 92nd Separate Marine Rifle Brigade arrived in Stalingrad at the end of September and was immediately thrown into battle for the factory district. The Marines took up defensive positions on the banks of the Volga. The task was critical: to hold the crossings through which supplies were being delivered to the troops in the city. The Germans sought to reach the river and cut off the defenders from the left bank. The Marines held a narrow strip of the embankment, sometimes only 50 to 100 meters wide. Behind them was the Volga. There was nowhere to retreat. The fighting on the Volga embankment was particularly fierce. The Germans attacked every hour, trying to push the defenders into the river. The Marines fought for every house, every basement, every ruin. Street fighting went on day and night. Opponents engaged in hand-to-hand combat, fighting with knives, shovels, and rifle butts. The distance between positions was sometimes only 10 to 15 meters. On October 14th, the Germans launched a decisive assault. 3 divisions, supported by aircraft and artillery, struck the tractor factory and the Barricadi factory. The Marines held their defenses in the factory workshops, which had been turned into fortresses. The fighting was for every machine, every column. The Germans suffered huge losses but continued to advance. The Marines showed remarkable resilience. When they ran out of ammunition, the soldiers threw grenades. When they ran out of grenades, they went in with bayonets. The wounded refused to leave their positions and continued to fire. The dead were replaced by reinforcements ferried across the Volga under enemy fire. The embankment remained in Soviet hands. The Volga military flotilla supported the Marines with fire from its ships. Armored boats and gunboats fired directly at German positions. Minesweepers ensured the crossing of the Volga. The sailors of the flotilla evacuated the wounded and delivered ammunition under continuous fire. The connection between the land and sea sailors was unbreakable. November brought frost and ice floes on the Volga. The crossing became even more dangerous. Ice floes rammed the boats, and the crossing could only be carried out in short intervals. But the Marines continued to hold their ground. The soldiers froze in the ruins without warm clothes, starved, but did not retreat. The Volga bank remained Soviet. On November 19th, the Soviet counteroffensive began near Stalingrad. The Marines in the city went on the offensive, driving the enemy out of their positions. The enemy, demoralized by the encirclement of their group, began to retreat. The Marines liberated the factory buildings and cleared the embankment of the remnants of German units. By the end of January 1943, the encircled enemy group surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in complete victory. The Marines contributed to this victory. 12 Marines were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for their fighting in Stalingrad. The 92nd Marine Rifle Brigade was transformed into a Guards Brigade. Stalingrad became a symbol of the resilience of the Soviet people. The Marines proved that they could fight not only on the coast, but also deep in the continent, in urban combat conditions. The Volga embankment, held at the cost of thousands of lives, became as much a symbol as Mamayev Kurgan. The Black Pea Coats wrote their own page in the history of the Great Battle. The year 1944 was a turning point for the Baltic Fleet. After the blockade of Leningrad was broken and the liberation of the Baltic states began, the Marines returned to their primary purpose: amphibious operations. The Baltic Sea, which had been under enemy control for 3 years, once again became the arena for active operations by the Soviet fleet. The Marines prepared to storm the islands and liberate the coast. The first major operation was the liberation of the Moonsund Islands in the Baltic Sea. Isle, Dago, and Moon were controlled by German troops and used as a base to block the Gulf of Finland. The Soviet command planned to capture the islands, clearing the approaches to Tallinn and Riga. The Marines were to land in the first echelon. On September 29, 1944, the Moonsund landing operation began. The 8th Guards Marine Rifle Brigade, commanded by Colonel Alexander Matveyevich Andreev, landed on the island of Moon. The enemy put up fierce resistance. The German garrison had artillery, minefields, and well-fortified positions. The landing took place under fire from enemy coastal batteries. The Marines landed from boats under a hail of shells and bullets. Many boats were sunk right off the coast, and the soldiers had to swim ashore. But the beachhead was captured. By evening, there were about 3,000 Marines on the island who were expanding the captured territory. On October 5th, the entire island of Moon was liberated. The Marines began preparations for a landing on Isle, the largest island in the archipelago. The landing began on October 12th. This time, the Germans were ready and met the landing force with heavy fire. The losses were heavy, but the Marines managed to gain a foothold on the shore and began to advance into the interior of the island. The fighting on Isle lasted 2 weeks. The Germans defended every village and every hill. The Marines stormed the fortifications and fought in the forests and swamps. On October 24th, the island was completely liberated. The enemy evacuated the remnants of the garrison by sea, losing about 4,000 men killed and captured. The liberation of the Moonsund Islands opened the way to Riga. On October 13th, the capital of Latvia was liberated. The Baltic Fleet gained new bases for active operations. The Marines proved that they were capable of conducting amphibious operations against a well-fortified enemy on the islands. In the spring of 1945, the Marines participated in the liberation of the Courland Peninsula. A large German group was surrounded here, the Courland Pocket. The Marines landed behind enemy lines, putting additional pressure on the surrounded troops. The landings were small but effective. On April 17th, the last major operation of the Marines in the Baltic began. The assault on Pillau, the enemy's last stronghold in East Prussia. The Marines stormed the city from the sea and land. The fighting was fierce. The Germans defended themselves desperately, realizing that this was one of their last lines of defense. On April 25th, Pillau fell. For their operations in the Baltic Sea in 1944-1945, dozens of Marines received high awards. Several brigades were given the honorary names of the liberated cities. The Baltic Fleet's Marines ended the war with honor, returning to their primary purpose: amphibious operations. The Baltic landings demonstrated the evolution of the Marines during the war. From defending coastal bases in 1941 to offensive operations to liberate islands and the coast in 1944-1945. The Black Pea Jackets went from defenders to attackers, from apprentices to masters of amphibious warfare. But what events were taking place at the same time in the South? On April 8, 1944, the Crimean offensive began. After 2 years of occupation, Soviet troops returned to the peninsula to liberate it from German and Romanian forces. The 4th Ukrainian Front and the separate coastal army, supported by the Black Sea Fleet, began an assault on German fortifications. The Marines played a key role in this operation. On April 11th, the Marines landed in the Kerch Strait, capturing bridgeheads on the western shore. 3 Marine brigades, covered by aircraft and naval artillery, forced their way across the strait and broke through the German defenses. The enemy was taken by surprise. They did not expect a landing in this area. By evening, the bridgeheads had been expanded and joined into a single front. On April 17th, the liberation of Sevastopol began, a city that the Marines had defended in 1941-1942. Now the Black Peacoats returned as liberators. The approaches to the city were heavily fortified by the Germans. The same heights where the Marines had held their defenses 2 years earlier now had to be stormed. The Marines advanced from the east and from the sea. The 7th Guards Marine Brigade stormed Sapun Mountain, a key height on the approaches to Sevastopol. The Germans had turned the hill into an impregnable fortress with concrete pillboxes, minefields, and barbed wire barriers. On May 7th, after a powerful artillery barrage, the Marines launched their attack. The assault on Sapun Mountain lasted all day. The Marines blew up passages in the minefields, destroyed pillboxes, and launched bayonet attacks. By evening, the hill had been taken. The way to Sevastopol was open. On May 9th, the advance units entered the city. On May 10th, Sevastopol was completely liberated. The Marines recaptured the main base of the Black Sea Fleet. The remnants of the German-Romanian troops retreated to Cape Kerch-Feodosia, the very place where the defense of Sevastopol ended in July 1942. Now the situation had changed. The Germans were trapped, pressed against the sea. On May 12th, the liquidation of the Chersonesos group began. The Marines stormed the last strongholds of the enemy. The enemy tried to evacuate by sea, but Soviet aircraft and ships sank the vessels carrying the retreating troops. On May 13th, the resistance ceased. About 30,000 German and Romanian soldiers surrendered. The Crimean operation ended in complete victory. The peninsula was liberated in 35 days. 126 people were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for the liberation of Crimea, 24 of whom were Marines. Several Marine brigades received the honorary names Kerch and Sevastopol. The participants in the defense of Sevastopol, who returned to the city as liberators, experienced special feelings. They had avenged their comrades who had fallen 2 years earlier. The liberation of Crimea was of great strategic importance. The Black Sea Fleet regained its main base. The way was cleared for an offensive into Romania and the Balkans. The Marines showed that they were capable not only of defending themselves, but also of storming powerful enemy fortifications. The experience gained during 3 years of war had borne fruit. The Crimean operation was a triumph for the Soviet armed forces and the Marine Corps in particular. The Black Pea Jackets had come full circle, from the defense of Sevastopol to its liberation. The symbolism of this event was obvious to all participants, but the war continued and new tasks lay ahead. Where else would the Marines have to fight? On October 7, 1944, the last major Marine operation in the north began. The Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive operation was aimed at liberating the Arctic and bringing Soviet troops into northern Norway. The Northern Fleet's Marines, who had held the defense on the Rybachi and Sredny peninsulas for 3 years, finally went on the offensive. The time for retribution had come. The Karelian Front and the Northern Fleet concentrated a powerful strike force. The 12th and 63rd Marine Brigades prepared for the decisive blow. The task was ambitious: to break through the German defenses, which had been built up over 3 years, and reach the Norwegian border. The enemy had a fortified strip with concrete pillboxes, minefields, and natural obstacles in the form of rocks and tundra. On the morning of October 7th, after a powerful artillery barrage, the Marines went on the attack. The first line of defense was the Titovka River, which the Germans considered an insurmountable obstacle. But the Marines forced the river under fire and broke through the enemy's defenses. The enemy was stunned by the force of the attack. By evening, the first line of defense had been broken. Simultaneously with the land offensive, the Marines carried out amphibious operations behind enemy lines. On October 10th, a detachment of Marines under the command of Senior Lieutenant Viktor Nikolaevich Leonov landed at the port of Lina Kamari, deep behind German lines. Scouts captured the port, destroyed the garrison, and held it until the main forces arrived. On October 15, Petsamo, the main German base in the Arctic, was liberated. The Marines stormed the city after a short battle. The enemy retreated in panic, abandoning their equipment and warehouses. Petsamo was an important nickel center, and its loss deprived Germany of strategic raw materials. The liberation of the city was a turning point in the operation. On October 18th, Soviet troops crossed the Norwegian border. The Marines entered the territory of Allied Norway, occupied by the Germans. The local population welcomed the Soviet sailors as liberators. On October 25th, Kirkenes was liberated, the first Norwegian city to be freed from the Nazis. The Marines marched through the streets of the city to the cheers of the Norwegians. German troops continued their retreat deeper into Norway. The pursuit continued until early November, when the Soviet command ordered a halt. Political considerations prevented further advances into Allied territory. The Marines secured their positions ending combat operations in the Arctic. The Petsamo-Kirkenes operation was a brilliant victory. In a month of fighting, 2 German divisions were defeated, and the Soviet Arctic and part of northern Norway were liberated. The Marines went from defense to offense, proving their ability to break through the enemy's fortified defenses in Arctic conditions. 78 Marines were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for their participation in the operation. The 12th Marine Brigade was transformed into a Guards Brigade. Viktor Leonov, the legendary commander of the reconnaissance troops, became a twice hero of the Soviet Union. The exploits of the Marines in the North received nationwide recognition. 3 years of defending the Rybaki and Sredny peninsulas ended in a triumphant offensive. The Marines, who held their ground in incredibly difficult conditions, proved that patience and perseverance always pay off. The Arctic War ended in complete victory for the Black Pea Coats. They had done their duty and could be proud of their achievements. But while the last volleys were being fired in the north, new events were brewing in the Far East. Japan had not yet surrendered, and the Marines had a role to play in ending World War II. What battles awaited the Black Pea Coats on the shores of the Pacific Ocean? On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. The Pacific Fleet was tasked with liberating the Kuril Islands and South Sakhalin. The Marines were preparing for the last landings of World War II. The enemy was formidable. Japanese troops were fanatical and ready to fight to the last. Heavy fighting lay ahead. On August 18th, the Kuril landing operation began. The main target was Shumshu Island, the northernmost island in the Kuril chain. It was home to a powerful Japanese garrison of 8,000 men, with artillery, tanks, and fortifications. The Soviet command assigned the 101st Rifle Division and the Kamchatka Defense District's Marines to the landing. The landing began at 2 o'clock in the morning. Marines in boats and launches moved towards the shores of Shumshu. The Japanese discovered the landing force and opened heavy fire. Many ships were sunk or damaged. The soldiers reached the shore by swimming in the icy water, but the bridgehead was captured. By morning, there were about 1,300 Marines on the island. The Japanese immediately counterattacked. 20 tanks, supported by infantry, stormed the Soviet beachhead. The Marines had no anti-tank weapons. They had not been unloaded in time. The soldiers met the tanks with bottles of incendiary mixture and bundles of grenades. Several Marines threw themselves under the tracks, blowing themselves up along with the vehicles. The attack was repelled. The fighting on Shumshu lasted 3 days. The Japanese fought with the desperation of the doomed. Many preferred suicide to capture. The Marines slowly advanced into the interior of the island, destroying enemy strongholds. On August 23rd, the Japanese garrison surrendered. Shumshu Island was taken. The way to the Kuril Islands was open. On September 1st, the landing on Iturup Island began. Here, the resistance was weaker. Japan had already signed the Act of Surrender on September 2nd, but some Japanese units continued to fight. The Marines cleared the island of the remaining garrison. By September 5th, the entire island was under the control of Soviet troops. At the same time, landings were carried out on other islands of the Kuril chain. Small groups of Marines landed on Kunashir, Shikotan, and Urup, Everywhere, the Japanese put up resistance of varying intensity. But the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Japan had surrendered, and its garrisons were surrendering one after another. By the end of September, all the Kuril Islands were occupied by Soviet troops. Simultaneously with the Kurils, an operation was conducted on South Sakhalin. The Marines landed at several points on the southern coast, cutting off Japanese troops from the ports. The 16th Marine Brigade distinguished itself in the capture of the port of Maoka. The Japanese garrison put up stubborn resistance, but by August 25th, the city was taken. Southern Sakhalin was liberated. 23 Marines were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for their operations in the Far East. Several brigades were awarded orders. The Kuril operation was the last in the history of the Soviet Marine Corps in World War II. The war ended where Soviet territory ended, on the Far Eastern Islands. The Marines fought from the first day of the war to the last. From defense in 1941 to offensive landings in 1945. From the Arctic to the Kuril Islands, from the Baltic to the Pacific Ocean. The Black Peacoats fought wherever special fortitude and determination were required. They fulfilled their duty to their homeland. The Kuril Islands operation put an end to the combat history of the Marine Corps during wartime. Ahead lay peace, demobilization, and a return to civilian life. But the memory of the exploits of the Black Pea Jackets remained forever. What mark did the Marine Corps leave on the history of the war? Who were its heroes? During the 4 years of war, the USSR Marine Corps covered itself with unfading glory. 122 Marines were awarded the highest honor of the motherland, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Among them were brigade and regiment commanders, ordinary soldiers, and scouts. Each of them performed a feat worthy of eternal memory. Their names are inscribed in gold letters in the history of the Great Patriotic War. Caesar Lvovich Kunikov, Major, commander of the Novorossiysk Landing Force, was posthumously awarded the title of Hero. His landing on Malaya Zemlya became a model of daring and skill. Konstantin Fedosievich Olshansky, senior lieutenant, with a detachment of 68 men, captured the port of Nikolaev and held it until the main forces arrived. The entire detachment was killed, and all were awarded the title of Hero. Viktor Nikolaevich Leonov, senior lieutenant, commander of the Northern Fleet Reconnaissance Detachment, became twice a hero of the Soviet Union. His group carried out 52 operations behind enemy lines without a single defeat. Leonov's scouts were legendary. The Germans hunted them down, but without success. After the war, Leonov rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. Ivan Mikhailovich Sivko, a senior petty officer, covered the embrasure of a German pillbox near Leningrad with his body. Nikolai Andreevich Vilchevsky, a corporal, repeated Alexander Matrosov's feat on the approaches to Sevastopol. Dozens of Marines sacrificed themselves, giving their comrades the opportunity to complete their combat mission. Their self-sacrifice became legendary. Mikhail Pavlovich Panikov, a senior sergeant, destroyed 11 enemy tanks with an anti-tank rifle in the Battle of Stalingrad. Wounded, he continued to fire until he lost consciousness. He was awarded the title of Hero. Vasily Ivanovich Rachkov, a Red Army soldier, single-handedly repelled 3 attacks by a German company, destroying 37 enemy soldiers. There were hundreds of such examples of mass heroism. 5 Marine brigades were awarded the title of Guards. These were units that had distinguished themselves in battle and become models of valor. The 1st Guards Marine Brigade participated in breaking the blockade of Leningrad. The 2nd participated in the liberation of Crimea. The 3rd participated in the Battle of Stalingrad. The 4th and 5th participated in the battles in the Baltic. The Guards title was the highest honor for a military unit. Dozens of brigades received the honorary names of liberated cities: Odessa, Sevastopol, Kerch, Novorossiysk, Tallinn, Petsamo. These names forever linked the Marine units with the places of their military glory. The brigades wore these names as the highest award, a reminder of heroism and sacrifice. Over 100,000 Marines were awarded orders and medals: the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of the Red Star, the Order of the Patriotic War, the medals for courage and for military merit. These awards were given to soldiers and commanders for specific feats. Each award had its own history, its own combat episode. The Marines suffered heavy losses. There are no exact figures, but it is estimated that about half of all Marines who fought in the war were killed. This was the highest percentage of losses among the branches of the armed forces. The explanation is simple. The Marines were used in the most dangerous areas, in the most critical situations. The black pea jackets were thrown into the thick of battle, where the fate of the war was being decided. But the losses were not in vain. The Marines played a key role in the defense of coastal cities, amphibious operations, the breaking of the blockade of Leningrad, and the battles for Moscow and Stalingrad. Wherever the black pea coats appeared, the outcome of the battle was decided. Their contribution to the victory cannot be overestimated. After the war, the memory of the heroes of the Marine Corps was immortalized. Monuments to the Marines were erected in hero cities. Streets were named after heroes. Museums preserve relics of black pea coats. Marine Corps veterans enjoyed special respect. What legacy did the Marine Corps leave to future generations? On May 9, 1945, the Great Patriotic War ended. The Marines met victory on various fronts, from Berlin to the Kuril Islands. The black pea coats had fulfilled their duty. Demobilization began and a return to peaceful life. But the traditions and experience accumulated over 4 years of war remained as an invaluable legacy for future generations. During the war years, about 500,000 people passed through the Marine Corps. From a single brigade in 1941, the branch grew to 50 brigades and numerous separate units. The Marines carried out 110 amphibious operations and participated in all the major battles of the war. From defense to offense, from the Arctic to the subtropics, the black pea coats fought everywhere. The combat experience of the Marines was carefully studied and summarized. Regulations, instructions, and training manuals were created. The experience of amphibious operations in various conditions, tactics for fighting in cities and rough terrain, and interaction with the Navy and Air Force were all systematized. The Marine Corps became a science, not just an art. After the war, the size of the Marine Corps was reduced. The Cold War dictated other priorities, but the branch of the military was preserved. Marine regiments and brigades were part of all four fleets of the USSR. They continued the traditions of wartime, maintained their combat training, and prepared for new challenges. The black pea jacket and undershirt remained symbols of the Marines. Traditions were formed on the basis of military experience. The motto, "Where we are, there is victory," became official for the entire Marine Corps. Black uniforms remained a distinctive feature. Marine Corps Day is celebrated on November 27th in honor of the first landing near Petrograd in 1715. The history of this branch of the military dates back to Peter the Great. Marine Corps veterans created their own organizations. They met on memorable dates, visited battle sites, and worked with young people. Passing on combat experience and traditions to new generations became their sacred duty. In schools and colleges, veterans talked about the war, the exploits of their comrades, and the price of victory. Their stories made a deep impression. The Marine Corps participated in post-war conflicts. Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, Afghanistan in 1979. Marines were present everywhere. They demonstrated high professionalism and resilience. The traditions established during the Great Patriotic War continued to live and work. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR, the Marines remained part of the Russian fleet. Moreover, their importance increased. Local conflicts, peacekeeping operations, the fight against terrorism. Well-trained Marines were needed everywhere. The modern Russian Marine Corps is the heir to the black pea coats of the Great Patriotic War. Memories of the war are preserved in museums, memorials, books, and films. Two soldiers, the shore and sea character. Cinema has captured the image of the Marine. Literature has created a gallery of heroes in black pea coats. Historians study the operations and exploits of the Marines. The memory lives on and is passed on to new generations. Modern Marines honor the traditions of their ancestors. When taking the oath, they swear to be worthy of the veterans of the Great Patriotic War. The vest and black beret are symbols of continuity. Young soldiers study the experience of war, visit places of military glory, and meet with veterans. The connection between times is unbroken. The legacy of the Great Patriotic War Marines is not only tactical techniques and combat experience. It is, above all, a spirit. Unyielding fortitude, readiness for self-sacrifice, loyalty to the oath and comrades. The black pea coats proved that there are no insurmountable obstacles, only a lack of will to win. This lesson is always relevant. The Marines were, are, and will remain the elite of the Russian Navy, the guardians of glorious traditions, and a symbol of the invincibility of Russian arms.